The emergency room at Hargrove Medical Center had a way of making everyone feel equal. The fluorescent lights didn't care whose name was on the donor wall, and the plastic chairs were just as uncomfortable for the rich as they were for anyone else. That was what Leonard Croft had always liked about it. He sat in the third row from the entrance, a paper cup of vending machine coffee going cold in his hand, wearing the same canvas jacket he'd had since his youngest in Sustard Middle School. The elbows were soft from too many winters. One of the buttons had been replaced with something that didn't quite match. He hadn't noticed, or if he had, he hadn't minded. Nobody in that waiting room knew him. That was in its own way a relief. He wasn't there for himself. He was there because his neighbor's granddaughter, a girl named Penny, 7 years old and terrified of IV needles, had been brought in that afternoon with a fever that spiked so fast her grandmother, Dolores, had called Leonard before she'd even called 911. He had driven them. He had parked the car. He had walked them inside and waited. That was all. The waiting room was quieter than most Friday afternoons. A man across the aisle was watching something on his phone without headphones. A young mother was trying to keep a toddler from pulling the magazines off the side table. Near the window, 3 people in expensive coats stood together in the way that people stand when they've never had to wait for anything. Weight shifted forward, eyes moving to the front desk every 40 seconds, mouths pressed thin with impatience. Leonard noticed them the way he noticed most things, quietly, without comment. One of the 3 was doing most of the talking. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, sharp-featured, the kind of polished that took real effort and real money to maintain. Her coat was a deep charcoal with a belt that had never been loosened. Her name, Leonard would later learn, was Sylvie Drummond, Director of Development at Hargrove Medical, the person responsible for securing the private donations that kept the new cardiac wing funded, and her own photograph on the hospital's annual report. She was not a patient. She was not waiting for a patient. She had come to walk through the new donor lounge on the 3rd floor and had made the mistake of entering through the main ER entrance because the parking situation near the private entrance had been, in her words to the man beside her, completely unacceptable. She was irritated before she even walked in. That was the kind of thing you could see on a person if you looked. Leonard wasn't looking. He was thinking about Penny, and whether Dolores had eaten anything since lunch, and whether the coffee in this machine was ever actually hot, or whether it was always this temperature. Then Sylvie Drummond looked at him. It was the kind of look that doesn't announce itself as unkind. It just moves over a person like their furniture, assesses, and moves on. She took in the jacket, the mismatched button, the paper cup, the worn boots with the crease across the right toe that never quite went away, no matter how many times he'd tried to smooth it out. She leaned slightly toward the man beside her, a younger colleague named Brett, who had the practiced expression of someone who had learned to agree with his superior on aesthetic matters, and said something Leonard couldn't hear. Brett smiled in the way people smile when they don't fully endorse a joke, but don't want to be seen not laughing. Leonard noticed. He said nothing. He took a sip of the cold coffee and decided it wasn't worth finishing. 10 minutes later, Dolores came back from the pediatric wing with an update. Penny's fever was coming down. They were monitoring her. It would probably be another hour. Leonard nodded and told her to go back in. He'd be here. She looked at him the way people look at someone who has never once made them feel like a burden, and she went. He settled back in the chair. It was Sylvie who made the decision to approach the intake desk, apparently dissatisfied with the wait for the elevator bay that would take her up to the donor lounge. She walked past Leonard without seeing him in any meaningful sense and asked the woman behind the desk, a tired-looking nurse administrator named Greta, who had been on shift since 6 in the morning, whether there was a faster route to the private 3rd floor suite. Greta was explaining when Sylvie's attention drifted back to the waiting area. Her eyes settled again on Leonard. "Is there a reason," she said, not lowering her voice, "that people are allowed to just sit here without checking in?" She turned back to Greta. "That man has been sitting there since before I arrived. He doesn't look like he's waiting for anyone." Greta, who had seen a great many things in 18 years at this desk, said carefully that the waiting area was for anyone accompanying a patient. "He doesn't look like he's with anyone," Sylvie said. Leonard heard this. He didn't turn around. He was looking at the double doors that led to the pediatric wing, where a little girl was scared of needles and her grandmother was holding her hand, and he was thinking about how he would take them both for pancakes afterward, because Penny had mentioned pancakes twice in the car, and fear and hunger have a way of running together in children. The man named Brett shifted his weight and looked at his phone. Greta said, "Sir, are you accompanying a patient today?" Leonard looked up. "Yes," he said. "Pediatrics. Penny, her last name is Okafor. Her grandmother's with her." Greta nodded and turned back to her screen in a way that closed the subject. Sylvie Drummond did not look embarrassed. She looked, if anything, mildly annoyed at having been given an insufficient answer. She turned back to the elevator conversation and lowered her voice by perhaps 15%. Leonard went back to looking at the doors. What Sylvie did not know, what very few people in that building knew, and none of the people in that waiting room, was that the cardiac wing she was walking to, the one that bore a small bronze plaque near the entrance with the words, "In recognition of significant contribution to Hargrove Medical Center," existed in the form it did largely because of a single conversation Leonard Croft had had with the hospital's board chair 7 years ago. Not a formal meeting, not a pitch. A conversation at a hardware store, two men looking at the same brand of exterior paint, one of them mentioning offhandedly that he'd been trying to figure out what to do with a portion of capital he'd freed up after selling his third company, and whether there was anything worth doing with it locally. The board chair, a man named William Aldgate who had known Leonard for years, had mentioned the cardiac wing. Leonard had written a check. He had asked for no naming rights. He had attended no ribbon cuttings. When the annual report went out with a list of major donors printed in a special typeface, his name was there in the same size as everyone else's halfway down the page, the way he preferred it. He sold industrial water filtration systems. That was what he told people if they asked what he did, which wasn't often because he didn't go places where people asked. He had started the company in his garage 23 years ago. He had sold it, started another one, sold that too. He had invested quietly and well. He lived in a house that was comfortable rather than impressive, drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and spent most of his free time doing exactly what he was doing now, being useful to people who needed someone useful nearby. He had a daughter in Portland who called him every Sunday. He had a dog named Harold who was too old to go on long walks anymore, but still tried. He had a workshop in the back of his property where he built furniture no one had asked for and gave it away to people who needed it. He was not a man who thought about himself very much. Sylvie Drummond had gone upstairs by the time the elevator arrived. Brett followed her without looking back. The waiting room settled into its usual low hum. The phone without headphones, the restless toddler, the fluorescent lights. Leonard got up, threw away the cold coffee, and got another one. The second cup was also not very hot. The donor lounge on the third floor had been designed to impress, and it succeeded. The walls were a warm cream that suggested expensive decisions made by people who understood the psychology of generosity. There were fresh flowers. There was good coffee from an actual machine, not a vending unit. There were framed photographs of wings and buildings and smiling people in hard hats at groundbreakings. The visual vocabulary of institutional gratitude. Sylvie Drummond moved through the room with the ease of someone who had designed several rooms like this and understood exactly what each choice was meant to communicate. She had her tablet out and was going through the program notes for the upcoming gala. A fundraising dinner in 6 weeks that was supposed to bring in somewhere north of $3 million if everything went the way it was supposed to. The event coordinator for the gala was a woman named Terry, who had arrived before Sylvie and was now standing near the window waiting to begin the walkthrough. Terry had the quietly efficient demeanor of someone who had dealt with a great many Sylvie Drummonds and had learned which battles were worth having. "The layout's been adjusted," Terry said, pulling up a floor plan on her own tablet. "We've added a reception area near the east corridor so the major donors have a gathering space before they're brought into the main room." Sylvie nodded. "Who's confirmed in the top tier?" Terry named several names. Sylvie recognized most of them. Families she had cultivated over years, whose generosity was reliable and well documented, and whose interest in being recognized publicly was something she understood how to manage. "And we're still expecting Dr. Whitmore?" Sylvie asked. "Yes, he confirmed last week." Dr. Francis Whitmore was Hargrove's chief of cardiology, the public face of the cardiac wing, the man whose name appeared on the research that had made the wing's work internationally known. He was also, Sylvie had learned over 3 years of working with him, the kind of person who made donors feel that their money was going somewhere real. He had the combination of medical authority and genuine warmth that fundraising events ran on. She needed him at the gala the way a fire needs oxygen. "Good," Sylvie said. She was walking toward the window to check the sightline from the speaking podium when her phone rang. She glanced at it, excused herself, and stepped into the hallway. It was her assistant. There was a situation with the venue parking structure, something about a permit that hadn't been finalized. Sylvie listened, asked 3 sharp questions, received insufficient answers, and ended the call with the particular kind of clipped courtesy that meant the situation was now her assistant's problem to solve before end of day. She stood in the hallway for a moment, recalibrating. Down the corridor, the elevator doors opened, and 2 people stepped out. A nurse she didn't recognize, and behind him, Leonard Croft. Sylvie registered him without processing. He was the man from the waiting room, the canvas jacket, the wrong button. He was here on the 3rd floor, in the donor corridor, and he was walking with the kind of unhurried certainty that people have when they know exactly where they're going. "Excuse me," she said. Leonard stopped. "This is a restricted corridor," she said. "The 3rd floor is for hospital staff and invited guests. I'm going to need you to go back downstairs." Leonard looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has been misread many times and made his peace with it. "I'm here to see Dr. Whitmore," he said. "Dr. Whitmore is in a meeting. He's expecting me," Leonard said. "I'm the director of development for this institution," Sylvie said, and there was something in her voice that had graduated beyond mere irritation into a register that felt like authority being exercised on principle. "I know Dr. Whitmore's schedule. He doesn't have any outside appointments this afternoon." The nurse beside Leonard had gone quiet in the way that people go quiet when they sense they're in proximity to something they don't want to be part of. Leonard said, simply, "You could call him." There was a beat. Sylvie pulled out her phone. She called the extension for Dr. Whitmore's administrative assistant, a woman named Ruth, who picked up on the 2nd ring. "Ruth, it's Sylvie Drummond. I have a situation in the donor corridor. There's a man here who says he has an appointment with Dr. Whitmore. Can you tell me what's on his schedule?" A pause. Then Ruth's voice with the careful neutrality of someone who has been put in a delicate position. "Could you ask him his name?" Sylvie looked at Leonard. "Your name, Leonard Croft," he said. She relayed it. There was a longer pause. Then Ruth said something that made Sylvie's expression shift. Not dramatically, not in any way she would have wanted observed, but the change was there. "I see," Sylvie said. She lowered the phone. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Dr. Francis Whitmore came through it, and with him was a man Leonard recognized. William Aldgate, the board chair, now in his late 60s, who had been buying exterior paint on an October afternoon 7 years ago, and had mentioned almost as an aside that the cardiac wing needed a benefactor. William Aldgate saw Leonard and his face did something uncomplicated and genuine. He walked down the corridor at a pace that didn't match the measured dignity of the space, and when he reached Leonard, he took his hand with both of his, the way people do when they actually mean it. "Leonard," he said, "you're early. That's new." "The traffic was better than I expected," Leonard said. Dr. Whitmore shook his hand next. "We've been looking forward to this. Ruth has the room set up." Sylvie Drummond was still standing where she had been. No one had introduced her. No one had turned to include her. She was not being excluded in any deliberate way. It was simply that the reunion happening in front of her had a gravity that didn't require her participation, and the absence of that participation had its own weight. Dr. Whitmore, who had the genuine warmth Sylvie had always appreciated from a professional distance, noticed her standing there and said, "Oh, Sylvie, do you know Leonard Croft?" "He's the cardiac wing," William Aldgate said simply. Dr. Whitmore nodded. "Largely, yes. We wouldn't have the imaging suite without what Leonard made possible. And the research fellowship program, that was his as well." Sylvie Drummond understood in the way that one understands when something falls into place that should have been obvious. She understood what the plaque near the entrance meant, and why his name was in the annual report, and why Ruth had paused when she asked. She looked at Leonard. He was not looking at her with satisfaction. He was not looking at her at all, particularly. He was listening to something William Aldgate was telling him about the fellowship program, The first fellow who had just published a study in a journal that mattered. Something about outcomes in underserved rural populations, and Leonard was listening with the focused attention of someone who cares more about the thing than about being seen caring about the thing. Sylvie said, "Mr. Croft, Leonard," he said without any performance. She stopped. Then, "Leonard, I apologize. I should have. It's all right," he said. It wasn't dismissive. It was simply true, in the way that such things are true for people who don't collect grievances. He wasn't keeping a ledger. She didn't know what to do with that. Most people wanted the apology to matter more. Most people wanted to see you understand the extent of the mistake, so that the forgiveness could be proportional. Leonard Croft apparently did not need the forgiveness to be proportional. He turned back to William Aldgate. They walked together toward the room at the end of the corridor. Sylvie stayed where she was for a moment. Terry, the event coordinator, had materialized at her elbow at some point during the exchange and now stood quietly with her tablet, waiting for direction. "The flowers in the reception area," Sylvie said finally. "What are they?" "White ranunculus," Terry said. "Change them," Sylvie said. "Something else, something less." She paused. "Just something that doesn't look like we're trying." Terry made a note. "Of course." They walked back into the donor lounge. Out the window, the afternoon was thinning toward evening, the kind of low, late light that makes hospital parking lots look, briefly, like something almost peaceful. Somewhere on the floor below, a little girl named Penny was no longer afraid of her IV, because her grandmother had told her the story of the man who brought them there, the neighbor who always showed up when you needed someone to show up. And that story had been enough to keep her still while the nurse counted to 3. Leonard didn't know she'd been told the story. That was the thing about Leonard Croft. The good he did had a way of moving through the world without him tracking it. The gala was 6 weeks later, on a Thursday evening in the middle of November, when the cold had just begun to mean it. Sylvie Drummond had spent the intervening weeks doing what she always did before a major event, managing logistics, managing donors, managing the 37 small crises that accumulate between a plan and its execution. She was good at this. It was arguably what she was best at. She told herself that what had happened in the donor corridor was an isolated incident, a case of incomplete information, the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. She almost believed it. The gala drew 260 people. The room looked the way it was supposed to look, warm, significant, the kind of space that made generosity feel like the obvious choice. Dr. Whitmore spoke with the authority and warmth he always brought. William Aldgate gave remarks that were brief enough to be listened to, which was rarer than it should have been. Leonard Croft arrived near the end of the cocktail hour, after most people had found their seats. He came in through the main entrance, coat over his arm, and stood near the back while his eyes adjusted to the room. He was wearing a jacket that was better than the canvas one, though not by an enormous margin. His shoes were clean. He had told William's assistant he didn't need to be seated at the head table. He never needed to be at the head table. Sylvie saw him come in. She had been crossing the room toward a cluster of donors who needed attending, but she altered her course without quite deciding to. "Leonard," she said. He looked up. "Mrs. Drummond." She had the particular experience of someone who has rehearsed a moment and discovered on arrival that the rehearsal was insufficient. She had planned something. Not an apology exactly. She had already apologized. But something further. Something that acknowledged the fuller shape of what had happened in that corridor. But standing in front of him in that room, with the speeches ending and the soft orchestral arrangement starting up, and the whole machinery of institutional gratitude running at full capacity around them, she found the prepared words felt like the wrong size. So she said something else instead. "Thank you for the imaging suite. I read about the outcomes in the study last month. The rural communities, I hadn't understood before what the research was actually doing." Leonard considered this for a moment. "The first fellow is the one doing the work," he said. "I just made the room. You made more than the room." He looked at her in the same way he had looked at her in the corridor, without settling a score, without needing her to feel the full weight of anything. "There's a lot of room left to make," he said. She didn't know if he meant that literally or otherwise. She suspected both. He moved toward his table, somewhere in the middle of the room, the seat he had requested, nowhere special. She watched him go. He stopped once to speak with a woman she recognized as a longtime volunteer at the pediatric ward, and the conversation he had with her lasted several minutes. Real minutes, the kind where both people are actually listening. Sylvie turned back toward the donors who needed attending. The night went well. The pledges exceeded the target by 11%. Dr. Whitmore's remarks were quoted in the hospital's communications the following week. The photographs from the event were handsome and would be useful for the next annual report. In none of the photographs was Leonard Croft visible. He had positioned himself, as he always did, at the outer edge of things, present without being prominent, there without needing to be seen. That was his way. The imaging suite was booked 6 weeks out. The fellowship fellow had submitted a second study for peer review. Somewhere in a county 3 states away, a man who'd had no access to advanced cardiac imaging 18 months ago had been diagnosed early enough that the word early still meant something. He didn't know the name Leonard Croft. He didn't know about the gala or the donor lounge or the plaque near the entrance of the cardiac wing. He knew that someone had looked at his heart in time, and that the looking had changed what came next. The floor beneath his feet, the light in the room where they told him the news. The whole architecture of a second chance, built quietly, without ceremony, by a man in a worn canvas jacket who drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and brought his neighbor's granddaughter to the hospital on a Friday afternoon, and waited, and did not require a single person to know he had.